What's going on, everybody? Jolt here from TheTokenMinorities, and we are back with our draft analysis for the GBA D-League Season 3. Super excited for this opportunity, really grateful for it too. This is something I've been wanting to be a part of for quite a while, ever since the D-League first came out, honestly, and to finally have that opportunity to be involved, it's pretty awesome for sure. Now, before I go any further, I wanted to welcome any new viewers that will be watching this video for the first time on our channel. I hope you will enjoy your stay and maybe enjoy some of the other content on the channel. You can see some TCG related content if you are interested in that, and if you're more on the draft side of things, you can expect 1 or 2 draft videos at least per week. Now, let's go ahead and jump on into this draft analysis, as this is looking to be a pretty tricky one, honestly, for me, as I've never actually done a tiers-based draft before. And that is what this is. It's a tiers-based draft where we have to draft Pokemon in the following tiers. So we have a Tier 1, a Tier 2, 2 Tier 3s, a Tier 4, a Tier 5, a Mega, and then 4 free picks that collectively have to have a points value that adds up to 400. So I'll try to walk you through that as best as possible throughout all this, as that might be a little confusing to some of you who maybe aren't as familiar with the tiers-based system, but I'm going to assume that at least the majority of my viewers here will have already at least been exposed to a tiers-based system before. But even so, I'll try to help out those who might not be as familiar with it. But yeah, it's my first time trying to draft with a tiers system, and that does present some challenges, as it's not going to be the same as an open draft, which is probably what I'm most comfortable with, where you can literally just draft any Pokemon at any time and just basically pick the best thing available at all times. It's very different from that, because you do have that requirement to pick up some of these lower tiered Pokemon, which basically are Pokemon that might be, you know, like Tier 5, the lowest tier would be something like NU and PU in Smogon tiers. Tier 4 is usually stuff that's like lower RU, Tier 3 is higher RU, UU. Basically, it's not exactly right, but that's kind of how it's set up. But yeah, so I have to be able to really manage my points well, to the point where I'm picking up some low tier stuff that can still fill some crucial roles on my draft. And yeah, so that's definitely going to be tricky for me here in completing this draft, but I do think I have a good grip on maybe some of the better priced Pokemon in the lower tiers, Pokemon that maybe I would consider maybe a little better than what they're actually priced in the GBA D-League. So that's something I definitely am looking into as I'm making this draft, trying to find the best deals possible for Pokemon that fit my playstyle, as well as Pokemon that just in general are very useful in a lot of different matchups. So just some of the things I'm looking for in this draft. Now let's talk about where I'm positioned a little bit now before we dive in any further. So I have the number 4 overall pick. That means I can almost get anything I want. And with that in mind, I was kind of starting to build draft plans around Tapu Koko's. Tapu Koko's Amon, I think, is super good in draft format, and I really wanted to give it a try, and usually it doesn't go before number 4 overall, but it actually went number 1 overall, so we're not going to get that opportunity. So then I was also looking at Magearna, as that was something that the GBA is allowing for this season to test out, and that went number 2 overall, so I can't have that either. So we ended up actually going with Mew for the number 1 overall pick for the Toronto Staraptors, and number 4 overall in the draft. So Mew, super versatile, as you know, I'm sure. Just a really versatile and a very, just a tough Pokemon to predict for an opponent. It can fulfill so many different roles, being the hazard role, it can be more of an offensive setup role, it can be supportive with even something like Baton Pass, or just different support moves like Taunt and Super Fang. It's very good defensively, able to take hits from a huge amount of things in draft format. Some of the biggest threats in draft format are actually checked pretty well by Mew, a Mew that is designed properly, so Mew can do a ton of stuff. And I really think Mew is the kind of Pokemon that benefits my playstyle a lot, or benefits from my playstyle a lot, because it's able to do so many things, and I feel like I'm pretty unpredictable in my prep. And it's naturally bulky and naturally relatively fast at base 100. Yeah, it's just a match made in heaven for me, I think. So really excited to use Mew here in this season of the D-League. So at this point in the draft, that's kind of what I was thinking I was going to build my team around, right? Because I have this Mew, and in order for Mew to shine at its best, a draft really needs to be specifically tailored around it so that it's not restricted into a specific role for every single game. But we turn the page to round 2. I had the number 4 overall pick in the first round. It proceeds snake style, so it comes all the way back to me, number 17 overall for my round 2 pick. There's 16 picks Mega Kangaskhan had not been picked up yet, and it was allowed in the GBA D-League for this season as a means of testing it without Seismic Toss. I don't think anyone is going to ever allow Mega Kang again with Seismic Toss. The NPL made that mistake, but we're not going to allow that again in the NPL either. But GBA D-League is testing Mega Kang without Seismic Toss, and you know what? It didn't get picked up in the first 16 picks, and it was right there on the draft board when it was my turn. I really didn't plan to build around Mega Kangaskhan because who in their right mind would expect Mega Kang to survive all the way to number 17 overall? But you know what? It was there and we took it. So we are now building a draft around Mega Kang and Mew, two super versatile Pokemon. And the only weakness Mega Kang has in fighting is already covered by Mew. One of the, I believe, 3 weaknesses that Mew has in Ghost is covered by Mega Kang. So already a pretty nice core there synergetically. But Mega Kang is a very tricky Pokemon to build around because on its own, despite it being a very powerful wall breaker, despite it being very bulky on its own as well, it can't do things alone. It really does need a lot of support despite how good it really is. So once I picked up Mega Kang, the idea of the draft had to be to build around Mega Kang instead of building around Mew. So things really kind of shifted there after getting that round 2 Mega Kang. But Mew is still very good support for Mega Kang, so it's not like Mew is a wasted pick by any means. It just means that now my draft plan isn't necessarily going to be everything pointing towards Mew and making Mew shine. No, now it's time to make Mega Kang shine, and there's a few key roles that need to be fulfilled in order for that to happen. And I'm going to go ahead and list them off here so you have an idea of what I'm looking for as I finish out this draft. But basically, what Mega Kang really needs is ways to prevent it from getting statused, as well as just ways to assist in its ability to break down an opposing team. So things that'll help out with that is a grounded poison. I think it's a very essential component just to make sure that toxic spikes aren't going to be an easy way to status and wear down Mega Kangaskhan, as it does not have access to leftovers for its bulky sets, obviously, so it wants to have as much health as possible and not have that residual damage if it can be avoided. Another important component, just in case it does get statused, is a variety of Heal Bell users. One, I already have the Mew for that role, which is pretty nice, but an additional one would probably be good because Mew doesn't want to be locked into the role as a Heal Beller. And then another thing that helps Mega Kangaskhan a lot is a variety of fighting resistances. We already have one in Mew, but I will need to probably draft several other ones that'll come frequently throughout the season, just so that teams aren't able to freely click fighting moves against Mega Kangaskhan, as if it's not a super effective move against Mega Kang, it probably doesn't OHKO because Mega Kang is that bulky. So yeah, having a lot of fighting resist is nice. Another important thing is to have maybe a hazard stack option with spikes and Stealth Rock and Toxic Spikes, as Mega Kang does do a lot of damage to opposing teams, but it actually doesn't OHKO quite as many things as you might expect after the Parental Bond nerf this gen. So having the hazard stack option definitely would benefit Mega Kangaskhan in a variety of matchups, and that's something that I would like to complete the hazard stack core for this draft to make Mega Kang shine to the best of its ability. But with all that said, there's actually one thing that I think that Mega Kang needs more than all of those that I've already mentioned, and that is a lot of knockoff support, because everybody and their mother is going to run Rocky Helmets to deal with Mega Kangaskhan. Because Mega Kangaskhan hits twice, Rocky Helmet does like 16% of damage or something like that each time it makes contact. Mega Kang itself actually does 32% of damage to itself whenever it makes contact with the Rocky Helmet because of the 2 hits. So yeah, variety of knockoff users as well is something that is really important for building around Mega Kang. So those are just some of the roles to be looking out for as I work through this draft plan. Now we already have the Tier 1 filled with the Mew, we have the Mega filled with the Kangaskhan, and we're now on our way to round 3. I could very well pick up another Tier 1 Pokemon here as one of my free picks in round 3. I could do that. I don't think it's really necessary yet because there are some Pokemon chilling in Tier 3, multiple, that arguably could be actually in Tier 2 given a different perspective. And when there's Pokemon like that chilling in a lower tier than I personally would value them as, I feel like it's in my best interest to grab those earlier rather than later. So for round 3, I'm going to pick up a Tier 3 Nidoqueen. Now Nidoqueen, good old reliable, super good in Gen 6, equally as good, almost equally as good in Gen 7. I think the only reason why it might be a little bit worse in Gen 7 than it was in Gen 6 is the power creep and the speed creep overall. Whereas you're going to see a lot more offensive teams in Gen 7, a lot more teams with a higher higher average base speed stats, whereas in Gen 6 you would see a fair amount more balance to bulkier builds, which Nidoqueen would be able to naturally outspeed and more effectively run Life Orb sets against. But even so, this gen Poison Ground typing is still phenomenal against the powerful electric types like Tapu Koko and Xurkitree, also really nice against Toxic Spikes as well as Fairies, being Poison typing is really good in general against Fairies, so the typing itself is still very, very good this gen, and that won't change. It also has access to Priority, which is nice, coupling with my 2 other Pokemon already that have Priority on them, and if you followed me for a while, you will probably already know that I'm a pretty big sucker for Priority, no pun intended with Sucker Punch, obviously, but but yeah, I love my Priority, and having 3 Priority users right off the bat is certainly really nice here on this draft. So Nidoqueen fills that role as being the grounded poison, preventing Toxic Spikes from being an easy way to deal with Mega Kangaskhan, as well as being an additional rocker to take stealth rocking pressure off of Mew as well, again giving it a little more freedom to do what it needs to do here for this team. Also has access to Toxic Spike, so I now have 2 of the key hazard roles filled. The only role that I'd say isn't really essential for Mega Kang is like a Sticky Web user in terms of the hazards, but that obviously would still be pretty nice when Mega Kang has base 100 speed. Could definitely benefit from Sticky Web if that becomes an option, but it's not something I'll really stretch to get, if you know what I mean. So yeah, so we got the tier 3 Nidoqueen in round 3, super solid Pokemon overall. I'm sure many of you have used it or seen it used in your respective draft leagues, so you know what kind of monster it really is, and being also another fighting resist for Mega Kangaskhan, just I really think will help it out a lot this season. So building around those 3 Pokemon now, a pretty solid core overall, especially considering I still have access to at least 1 more tier 1 and definitely 1 more tier 2 at least. So yeah, very good spot to be in here at round 3. Now at round 4, we're going to jump on over to another tier 1 pick. I felt that this was the best possible time to pick up what in my opinion was one of the 2 best possible offensive teammates for Mega Kangaskhan. Those 2 possible options were Weavile and Tornadus-T. Weavile is kind of... Okay, the reason why I don't like Weavile as much when compared to Tornadus-T for this role is that I want this Pokemon to be both fast and as well as being a solid knockoff user that's basically is tougher to switch into and tough to predict. Weavile, while it is tough to switch into, it is not exactly tough to predict. It's almost always going to click an Ice move or knockoff, and while that is very good coverage, that's not really what I think I needed this role to do. I needed this role to be a bit unpredictable, such that I might be able to catch a Pokemon trying to switch into Mega Kangaskhan with a knockoff at some point during the game to get rid of that Rocky Helmet before it becomes a problem for Kang later. So what Torn does is it presents this kind of tricky situation for my opponents where they have to very carefully choose what they switch into Torn, and you just can't switch in a Rocky Helmet user on Torn unless you wanted to get knocked off. So it really limits what my opponent's switch-ins can be against my team, and that's what I'm really trying to do with my high tier picks. I'm trying to make it so that they have to dedicate a whole Pokemon to walling a whole Pokemon of mine, and because I have 11 Pokemon on my team, that's going to make things very hard for them as they can only bring 6. So this draft is really designed around abusing the fact that my opponent can only bring 6 Pokemon, and each individual Pokemon, especially my high tiers, will almost always require a specific counter to be able to effectively deal with them. So there's a lot going on there with that thought process. I hope I've articulated that well enough for you, but that's the general idea with this. So Torn-T, very high speed tier, something my team was lacking. I had nothing above base 100. As well as having access to Knockoff, Regenerator, which is very nice, and of course U-Turn for momentum and a ton of coverage moves. Super good Pokemon. I've had Torn-T in the past, one of my personal favorites because of its speed and ability to just regenerate off all kinds of damage. It's just a super fun Pokemon to have, and I just preferred it over Weavile for this particular role, being my second and final tier 1. I could have potentially gone for a third tier 1 Pokemon, but that would mean I would have to get, I believe, 2 tier 5s as my last 2 free picks, and I'm not about that tier 5 life, so we opted for this being my last tier 1 Pokemon in round 4. Also another fighting resist, so that's pretty nice. Now, round 5. We're going to actually not still not get that tier 2 Pokemon yet, because when I'm looking at the tier 2s, nothing really strikes me as something I want to urgently draft now because I absolutely need this for what I'm trying to do. Nothing struck me like that. But there are some tier 2s that, or tier 3s rather, that really did. And one of those was the Nidoqueen. We already talked about that. Grounded Poison, super good for my team. The other one is a Steel type. Now, there were 2 Steel types I was eyeing. Admittedly, one of them was in tier 2. That was Lucario. Lucario is not really a defensive Steel by any means. It's a very good offensive Pokemon, something I was heavily considering, but I wanted speed and I wanted more rockers. And the only other Pokemon that was a fighting type as well as a Steel type and had speed and could lay rocks is Cobalion, and that was another tier 3 Pokemon that I think in some eyes could be considered a tier 2 as well. So I think that's a very high value selection for the tier 3 possibilities. So Cobalion picking up the 5th overall slot on my draft. Really excited to use this. That's a Pokemon I've used in many mock battles for people, but I've never actually had myself, and it's so versatile. It can do a lot of stuff. It's an offensive threat with Swords Dance, as well as being a very good support Pokemon with, I believe, Taunt, Thunder Wave. Rocks, like I already said before, also has momentum from Volt Switch. It has a strong physical move pool as well as a pretty good special move pool. I wish it got Earthquake, but that's a minor problem. Something I can definitely adapt around. But yeah, just really nice for the team overall. Unfortunately, it does share the fighting weakness with Mega Kang, but that's not the worst thing in the world because synergetically it really helps out the rest of my team, as now I have an Ice Resist, albeit maybe not the best one to special Ice attacks, as it does have pretty low special defense, but still I think very solid for my draft overall at this stage. That fighting type is really nice offensively to help break down some of the things that might give Mega Kang some trouble, as well as having the momentum option to maybe force in some of his more physically defensive walls, Volt Switch on those, and get to go straight into one of my other threats like the Tornadus or maybe another special threat that I have later on in this draft. So yeah, Cobalion, a really nice pickup I think for this draft, and still maintaining that high speed tier pressure that my draft as a whole is currently exerting. With the 2 base 100s, we have the Tornadus at like 121 or 122 speed, and now we have the Cobalion at 106 or 108 speed. So yeah, high speed tiers overall. Nidoqueen not the highest, but not that low either. It still outspeeds pretty much all walls, which is pretty much all you need out of Nidoqueen, to be honest. So yep, so that's that. Now let's move on to round 6. Now here, still looking at value picks. Alright, so in tier 4, there's a few pretty good Pokemon, I would say. Some stuff that maybe could, in some people's eyes, slide up to tier 3. And one of those fills a pretty key role as being an electric immunity, which I already have Nidoqueen for that admittedly, but in order to most effectively deal with the electric types of this generation, Circuitry, Tapu Koko, it really helps to have multiple ground types with different weaknesses between them. And that means that I need to have a ground type that is not weak to Ice. The only type of ground type that can do that, I think, is something along the lines of a ground Steel, which I don't think exists. If it does, let me know. I can't think of one off the top of my head. I'm sure it exists. There's like a dual type for every Pokemon. There's a Pokemon for every dual type now, I feel. But anyways, a ground water type fits that mold very, very well. And there's a Pokemon chilling in tier 4 named Seismitoad that fits that role perfectly, as well as being an additional stealth rocker, as well as being a very high speed tier threat whenever I set up the rain. And I do have a couple Rain Dance users already on this draft. So Seismitoad picking up the number 6 overall position on this draft. Just super nice overall. It provides me another rock resist, being now my 3rd rock resist, to really help out Tornadus. It just partners super well with Tornadus. All of Tornadus' weaknesses, being rock and electric, are covered by Seismitoad, and Seismitoad's only weakness, being grass, is covered by Tornadus. So that core is super nice for sure. It also is another knockoff user, so this now is my 3rd knockoff user on my team to support Mega Kangaskhan. Also a stealth rocker, like I said before. Also, like I said before, it has the Swift Swim ability as a backup option whenever it is not the right time to run Water Absorb. Maybe when I want to run more of an offensive set and break through a team with lightning fast speed that Swift Swim would provide. So really excited to use Seismitoad. I've seen a lot of good things out of it, especially from Shoddy, as he has used the Seismitoad in a variety of leagues. So yeah, really excited to use that, and that'll be my bulky water for this draft. Now, next up in round 7, I decided to turn to some of my free picks here, as I've only used one of the free picks, and I really didn't feel hard-pressed to pick up my tier 2 quite yet, so I'm just kind of putting that on the back burner. As a matter of fact, I'm actually not going to pick that up until round 11, so I will talk about that when we get there. But for my 7th round pick, I actually decided to turn to a tier 4 free pick, which was Zoroark. So now Zoroark is filling the role as my dark type on my team. It's an essential role to fill, I think, this gen. There's a lot of bulky psychics. A lot of them get stored power and stuff. Like Necrozma is spooky. I don't want Necrozma or things like Cresselia to be able to run only psychic coverage against my team. So the Zoroark does help with that. And it's also a pretty nice speed tier, relatively redundant with Cobalion as a speed tier, but not really, because they have totally different roles, and they are slightly different speed tiers at that, as Cobalion might outspeed certain things that Zoroark doesn't, and Zoroark, yeah, just very different roles, both momentum options as well. Now let's talk about the ability a little bit here, because that's actually probably the biggest niche for Zoroark on this draft, aside from being my dark type. Now, what Zoroark has is Illusion, and I'm sure a lot of you already know how Illusion works, but it's a little bit different this gen on Wi-Fi because of, in my opinion, a flaw in the mechanics on Wi-Fi, whereas people are able to know if they have an attack option that is super effective against Zoroark, despite whatever Zoroark is disguising itself as, if that makes sense. So, for example, if someone had a fighting type out against the Zoroark disguised as a Seismitoad, the Zoroark would still, or it would still tell the trainer that the fighting move is super effective against Seismitoad, for example. So that kind of sucks, but what I can do with Zoroark is I can disguise it as things like Mega Kangaskhan, I can disguise it as things like Cobalion, things like Mew, all these things that share a weakness with Zoroark, and that'll make it so that mechanic doesn't even reveal what I actually am in many cases. And that still makes Zoroark a very tricky little guy on my draft, as well as being an additional knockoff user, might be able to help out Mega Kang on that front. And being able to break down just a lot of the things that want to switch into those Pokemon that I mentioned, as I just think the type synergy there offensively is just super good. So yeah, I think Zoroark really fits this team super well, and shout out to a guy in my front office named David Magic. He helped out with that decision. I wasn't really sold on Zoroark, but it really actually fits the team super well. I was kind of eyeing Sneasel for a while for that slot too, which still would have been nice in my opinion, but that actually got drafted before I was able to pick it up here, so Zoroark was the most logical choice. And yeah, pretty excited to use it here. So in round 8, we are turning to another free pick, a tier 4 once again. This time filling more of that role as a Heal Bell user. I already mentioned that earlier. That's something Mega King really wants, is many Heal Bell users on the draft, just to make sure that it's not going to be burdened by statuses throughout each game. So in addition to that, many Heal Bell users are also fairies, so I was kind of thinking about a fairy in this slot as well. There were a few options, but the best option I felt for what this draft was turning out to be, and that is more of a bulky offensive team with a lot of speed, was actually regular Diancie. Now what Diancie does is it doesn't provide speed for me at all, but it covers a low speed tier that otherwise would basically be ignored if I were to have just a purely fast draft. So this forces some Pokemon like base 60s that are maybe more offensive to actually run speed investment to outpace Diancie, for fear of me being a faster Diancie, which is something I can do. Don't put it past me. I definitely can do that. And yeah, so that's just something that forces people to speed creep differently, which I think is pretty key. But also being the Heal Bell user, also being a fairy type to deny outrage spam, as Cobalion was really my only thing to deal with that up until this point. But also, this is now my first flying resist, which is pretty nice, as Diancie does chew up flying attacks for days. There was a Mega Pidgeot drafted in the league, I believe a Staraptor drafted as well, so Diancie can certainly help out on that front for dealing with those birds. Takes a little defensive pressure off of things like Mew and maybe Mega Kangaskhan if I were to try to run them more defensively for a certain matchup. Also takes pressure off of Seismitoad and etc. So yeah, really nice for my team defensively, and also has a pretty powerful Trick Room offensive set. Something that I would hope my opponents don't sleep on, as I would not be opposed to whipping that out from time to time, as my team really does force a lot of Scarfers and such to try to outspeed my most powerful Mons, so having something like a Trick Room option in the back could really be a detriment to my opponent if they don't prep accordingly for that. So that's the Diancie. Not a whole lot else to say other than it's also another Stealth Rocker, so now we have, I believe, 5 Stealth Rockers: Diancie, Seismitoad, Cobalion, Nidoqueen, Mew? I think I counted correctly, 5? I can't count on my fingers if I'm wrong, so whoops. But yeah, pretty nice for the team for sure. Now, next up in the round 9, we decided to pick up yet another Flying Resist because we don't have enough of them, I don't think. I think Flying is one of the most powerful offensive typings in the game, and I don't want to be severely burdened by not having multiple of them. I just don't want that defensive pressure on Mew. I do not want to put Mew into a defensive role every single game. I don't care if it has to have a specific role for the majority of the season. I just don't want it to always be defensive because I want Mew to be able to use a lot of its moves at any time, basically, if that makes sense. So we're picking up another Flying Resist here in round 9. Also going to be the Fire type here, as I don't have a Fire type yet on this draft, and I am kind of murdered by things like Scizor and Mega Scizor right now, so I need something to help me out with that. And there was a Pokemon just chilling in Tier 3, again dodging that Tier 2 and the Tier 5, as this would be my final free pick of the draft, and that is going to be Rotom-Heat. Now, I'm not a big fan of Rotom-Heat, I'm going to admit that right now. I've had it in the past, and it was a little underwhelming, but it does fit the team, and it does kind of do... It's kind of the only Pokemon available to me in those positions that I was able to still draft from that could do what I needed that spot to do. As in, it's an electric type, but didn't have an electric type. It's a fire type. It deals with the Scizors relatively well as other bugs that might give me trouble. And it's also in a speed tier that I had not yet filled, and being base like 86 or 88, something like that, as I had nothing right now between Seismitoad and the base 100s. So this was a very key speed tier to fill for sure. So Rotom does fill the speed tier. It fits the role as the bulky fire, still has momentum as an option, also has dual screens, which if you know me, you know I love my dual screens in the right matchups. So yeah, so Rotom-Heat I think was a pretty essential pickup, despite the fact that it's not my favorite Pokemon in the world. I'm going to do my best to make it work. So probably my least favorite Pokemon on this entire draft, if I'm being honest, but the shoe fit, so we had to pick it up here for this position, in my opinion. So now for round 10, we're going to go ahead and pick up my tier 5 Mon. There was one that I was pretty much eyeing the entire draft, two technically that I was eyeing. I was kind of looking at Lanoon as an option, as Lanoon is a severely underrated threat right now with the buff that it got from having Gluttony, plus the berries that will restore 50% of your health whenever you get to usually 25%, but because of Gluttony it's actually 50% and fully heals Lanoon. But there was a Pokemon my team needed a little bit more, as if you look across my roster, I don't currently have a 1000 Arrow switch in, so a grass type or a bug type would be kind of nice to make sure I don't just lose to Abandoned Zygarde, but I also don't have a ghost type, and if I'm wanting to take a hazard stack approach, I need something that can potentially block spin in specific scenarios. So I needed a ghost type, I needed a grass type. There were some options for that, but there's only one that's actually good, and that is Gourgeist. Now Gourgeist does have a little bit of versatility to it, having access to all the different pumpkin forms, which could be nice. I'm not sure how many different ones I'll actually end up bringing. The fatter the better, probably on pumpkin, but we will see on that depending on the matchup. But like I said before, 1000 Arrows resist, ghost type to spin block, as well as just in general being a good wall to physical attackers whenever I need it to be. And I think it has reasonably high speed depth as well. Don't quote me on that, I'm not exactly sure. Let me pull it up real quick actually before I just say something stupid here. Gourgeist, I can't spell, it's Gourgeist apparently. Gourgeist Super is the fat one, right? That's base 75 speed up. That's not too bad. With base 85 defense, or base 85 HP, and then base 122 defense for the super size, that's respectable, honestly, especially for a tier 5. So I think in terms of how as far as the tier 5s go, Gourgeist was a solid pickup here for this draft, as it does fill those two key roles. Now for round 11. Alright, so we still have that tier 2 pick just waiting. There's a lot of cool tier 2 mons I could pick up. There's things like Mimikyu still available, which could be nice. nice. I already had a Ghost, I already had a Fairy, but Mimikyu is nice for breaking down things for Mega Kang potentially. But like I said, right away as soon as I drafted Mega Kangaskhan, there was one key role along with that I have not yet filled, and that is a Spike user. So I look across Tier 2, and there's not many Spikes users. I think there's actually only one. And it just so happens that this one Pokemon is one of the biggest threats, period, this generation, even when its ability is nerfed a little bit. And that is Scolipede, as the GBA has decided to ban Speed Pass for the D-League. That's fair enough, not the worst thing in the world, but Scolipede on its own offensively, with Speed Boost supporting it, is still an enormous threat, especially with Z moves. And I will talk about the Z captains here shortly, but Scolipede offensively, enormous threat, and breaks. It helps, Mega Kangaskhan breaks well for it, and it breaks well for Mega Kangaskhan as well. So I think that collectively they do work together very well. Also is another fighting resist. My team has tons of fighting resist, so Mega Kang is going to love this draft, I'm sure. But it also has access to spikes and toxic spikes, so I have the hazard stack option on deck as well as the spin blocker and the Gourgeist, so a lot going for me here in terms of filling all of those roles that I talked about earlier to make Mega Kang shine as best as possible. So with all of that said, that is the draft. Let's talk about the Z captains a little bit here. So the GBA has this brand new Z captain policy that they're trying out here in the D-League, where coaches are allowed to basically spend a designated amount of points on their Z captains, and each Pokemon, each tier, it's kind of hard to explain this, each tier has its own price for turning it into a Z captain. So for example, a tier 1 costed people 80 points out of the 100 total, I believe, to turn a tier 1 Pokemon into a Z captain, while a tier 5 would cost 20 points. So if you were to make a tier 1 Pokemon your Z captain, you would have to make your only other Z captain a tier 5 if you're going to have 2 of them at all. So in my opinion, it wasn't really worth it for me to run Z Mew, as Munium Z is banned, first of all. It's also not really worth it for me to run Z Tornadus-T, because then my only other possible Z captain would be something like Gourgeist, my only tier 5. Z Gourgeist is not used for good reasons, so I do need to have a little bit of a different idea of how I want to approach this in order to most effectively spend my Z points. And I had a couple options I was playing with. Something like Z Cobalion could have been nice to really help my team offensively, but I felt like I had enough breakers. I don't think I really needed to make Cobalion a Z move user when it's more often than not going to fill more of a supportive role, or going to want another item, basically. So Scolipede, like I said before, is the biggest threat whenever it's a Z captain, especially for me, because it can't miss an attack with a Z move. That's pretty cool. But basically, just it's able to get Okos that it cannot do otherwise when it has a Z Crystal. And all Scolipede really needs is a couple turns to get up the speed boost before it becomes an insanely large threat against an opposing team. So I did opt for Z Scolipede, meaning I had a few points left to have a second Z Captain from Tier 4, and with that Tier 4 Z Captain pick, I decided to pick up the Zoroark as the second Z Captain. So the combination Scolipede and Zoroark, I think, is very solid, I think, as a duo of Z users. I think collectively, it was my best possible option, as Zoroark on its own is fairly easy to prep for, but Z Zoroark is a whole nother monster. It does force a lot more prep, I think, to have a Z move on Zoroark, because it has a lot of coverage and might be able to knock out whatever my opponent's counter was supposed to be, and I already talked about why Z Scolipede's a god, so that is the draft as a whole. Let me know what you guys think about the draft in the comments below. I personally think it's solid. I humbly believe it's actually one of the strongest drafts in the league, but it'd be interesting to see what the power rankers think on that, as well as all of you guys. So make sure to just let me know what you think in the comments. I'll be interested in seeing that, and I'm really interested in seeing how it all works out whenever I start building with this thing and doing battles, as it looks really fun to use. Mega Kang Mew, ooh, that's spicy. So that about wraps this up. I hope you did enjoy. Thanks for watching, and I hope you guys are looking forward to the Week 1 uploads on September 3rd, as like I already mentioned in my my channel promo, we will be taking on Leo, 6-Foot Hacks, and the Durham Druddigons in Week 1. Super excited for that, one of my favorite content creators there, and excited to get the chance to play him in Week 1. So thanks for watching, guys, and I will see you all next time. Peace.